They had 43 days of food left. The snow hadn't even started yet. Silas and May Rowan came to Wyoming with a wagon, a dream, and the kind of stubborn hope that either builds empires or breaks people completely. By October of 1881, it was starting to look like the latter. But then their geese started disappearing into the mountains every single morning and coming back fat, calm, and silent about where they'd been. What Silas and May found when they finally followed those birds would either save their lives or destroy everything they'd fought to build. If you've ever believed that the right secret, kept by the right people, could change an entire community, stay with me until the very end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The first thing Silas Rowan noticed about Wyoming was how much sky there was. Back in Ohio, the sky sat above you like a ceiling, something you glanced at, not something that pressed down on your chest and reminded you how small you were. Out here, it sprawled in every direction, unbroken and indifferent, and on the morning of October the 3rd, 1881, it was the color of old pewter, the kind of color that meant something was coming. He stood at the edge of what he'd been calling his field, though field was a generous word for 40 yards of rocky soil that he'd spent 3 months trying to convince into cooperation, and watched his breath fog in front of his face. The temperature had dropped 12 degrees overnight. He knew because May had made him buy a thermometer in Cheyenne before they'd left civilization behind, and right now he was grateful for it the same way a man is grateful for a doctor who tells him bad news. At least now he knew. Silas? May's voice came from behind him, low and flat. Not the tone she used when she was asking him something. The tone she used when she'd already figured something out and was deciding how to tell him. He turned. She was standing by the fence post, the one on the northeast corner that he'd never quite gotten plumb, with her arms crossed and her dark hair pulled back in a knot that was losing the battle against the wind. She was looking at the pen where they kept the geese. It was empty. Not the ordinary kind of empty, where the birds had wandered to the far end and were hidden by the scrub brush. Empty, like a room after someone's already moved out. "Where are they?" Silas said, which was a stupid question, but he said it anyway. "Gone." May walked toward him slowly, like she was thinking while she moved. Same as yesterday morning, and the morning before. Silas rubbed the back of his neck. He'd noticed the geese were missing for a couple of hours yesterday, but they'd come back by late afternoon and he'd told himself it was nothing. Animals wandered. That was a fact of life out here. You couldn't watch everything every second. But now, standing in front of an empty pen 2 mornings in a row, the math started to feel different. They had 11 geese. 11 geese represented roughly a third of their strategy for surviving the winter. Not because they'd slaughter them all, that would be idiotic, burning the furniture to stay warm, but because the eggs would keep, and the eggs could be traded, and trade was how you filled the gaps that your 40 acres of stubborn Wyoming soil refused to fill. Lose the geese, you lost the eggs. Lose the eggs, you lost your leverage. Lose your leverage? "Silas," May said again, and he could tell she was watching his face go through all of this. "Stop calculating and start thinking. Those are the same thing." "They really aren't." She stopped next to him and looked out at the mountains. The Laramie Range loomed to the west, all granite and shadow, the tree line ending abruptly where the rock took over. The peaks were already white, had been since September. "They come back every evening," she said. "You've noticed that. They come back calm. Not scared. Not hungry." So something out there is, she paused, choosing the word carefully, agreeable to them. Silas looked at the mountains and felt the particular exhaustion that had become his permanent companion since April, when they'd signed the homestead papers in a lawyer's office in Cheyenne, and he told May everything was going to be fine. He was 26 years old. He'd said it with complete conviction, which was the worst kind of lying, the kind where you believe yourself. "May, we can't go chasing geese up into—" "I'm not saying chase them." She turned to look at him directly, and he recognized that expression. It was the same one she'd worn when she'd talked him out of buying a second mule in Cheyenne. "We can't afford to feed it, Silas. We can barely afford to feed ourselves." And into buying the thermometer instead. She was usually right. That was the thing about May. She was usually right in ways that were inconvenient to argue with. "I'm saying follow them. Tomorrow morning. Early. Before they go. And the fence repairs? The fence will still be broken in the afternoon. He wanted to object further, but he was tired and the sky was pressing down, and 11 empty nesting boxes were staring at him from across the yard. He turned back toward the house. Fine, he said. Tomorrow. They were up before 4. May had insisted on it, which meant she'd lain awake half the night listening for sounds and had nudged him in the ribs at 3:45 with an urgency that suggested the house was on fire. It wasn't. It was just dark and cold, and she was already dressed and there was coffee on the stove, which Silas drank standing up because sitting down felt like a commitment to warmth that the morning didn't deserve. They positioned themselves behind the woodpile on the east side of the pen before 5 o'clock. The geese were still inside, restless in the way birds get before dawn, shuffling and muttering at each other in whatever language geese use to discuss their plans. Silas pulled his coat tighter and watched his breath and tried not to think about how much work wasn't getting done. May was perfectly still beside him. She had a gift for stillness that Silas had never quite managed to develop. In Ohio, she'd grown up watching her father track deer through woodlands where the snap of a twig could ruin an entire morning's work. And something of that patience had settled into her bones. Just before first light, that gray, uncertain hour when the world looks like a sketch of itself, the geese started moving. They didn't burst out in a panic. They filed out of the pen gate, which Silas noted with irritation he must have left unlatched the night before, and they waddled in a loose column toward the northwest. Purposeful, calm, like they knew exactly where they were going and had been going there for longer than anyone had noticed. Now, May whispered. They followed at a distance, picking their way through the scrub and loose rock. The geese moved steadily, unhurried, cutting through a dry creek bed and then climbing a gradual slope that Silas had never had reason to explore before. The ground was harder up here, the soil giving way to embedded stone, and there were stands of juniper that grew in twisted shapes from the cracks in the rock face. It took 40 minutes. Silas was starting to lose feeling in his left foot. He'd been meaning to resolate that boot since August, and the slope had gotten genuinely steep when the geese simply stopped. They had reached a section of cliff face, a vertical wall of gray granite maybe 30 feet high, crusted with lichen and split here and there by the particular patience of frost. At the base, 3 ancient junipers grew so close together that their branches interlocked into something almost like a wall of their own. The geese walked behind them and disappeared. Silas stopped walking. May stopped beside him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "There's something behind those trees," Silas said, because sometimes the obvious needed to be said out loud. "Yes." May was already moving forward. "May, Silas, I have a candle in my pocket and enough sense to turn around if I need to." She glanced back at him, and there was something in her face that wasn't quite excitement, but was in the same neighborhood. A cautious, careful alertness, like a door opening onto something unknown. "Are you coming?" He followed her through the junipers. The branches scraped against his coat and grabbed at his hat, and for a moment the trees were thick enough that he couldn't see anything at all, just the gray-green of the needles and the sharp resinous smell of them. Then he was through, and he stopped. There was a crack in the cliff face. Not a cave, exactly. Not yet. Just a vertical fissure in the granite, maybe 3 feet wide at the base and narrowing as it rose, the kind of thing you'd walk past 100 times and never notice because the junipers stood in front of it like a curtain. But from within the crack came something that stopped Silas completely. Warmth. Not dramatic warmth. Not the warmth of a fire or a furnace. A steady, mineral warmth, the kind that comes from deep rock, from places the frost has never reached. And with it, barely audible over the wind, something else. The sound of geese, resting, content. Silas looked at May. May looked at the crack in the cliff. "Well?" she said, after a moment. "Yeah," Silas agreed. They went back to the house. This is the part that most people never understand about May Rowan. She could have gone straight in. Any other person might have. The pull of the unknown is strong, and they were desperate enough that a warm cave full of geese might as well have been a gift, something to be seized immediately and sorted out later. But May had grown up watching what happened to people who grabbed at things too quickly. Her father had lost 3 fingers to a bear trap he'd been too eager to reset. Her uncle had lost a farm to a business partner he'd been too grateful to question. "We need rope," she said, when they were back at the house with the door shut against the wind. "And more candles. And we need to not be stupid about this." "I'm not being stupid," Silas said, though the truth was he'd been thinking about going back immediately, and she was right to pump the brakes. "You were calculating again." She poured them both coffee and sat at the table with her hands wrapped around her cup. "I could see it. You were already counting eggs." "Is that wrong?" She thought about it. "Not wrong, just—" She looked out the window at the mountains, which were still there, still enormous, still indifferent. "We don't know what that place is. We don't know if it's safe. We don't know why the geese go there, and we don't know what they do once they're inside." She looked back at him. "Before we do anything with it, I want to understand it." Silas wrapped his hands around his own cup. The coffee was weak. They'd been stretching the grounds, but it was hot. "That's going to take time we might not have." "I know." Her voice was quiet. "But ruining it in a hurry is going to take less time than that." They sat with that for a while. Outside, the wind was picking up. Silas could hear it in the chimney, that hollow moan that Wyoming wind made when it found a channel to run through. In 6 weeks, maybe 8, that wind would be carrying snow. Real snow, not the dusting they'd gotten in September, but the kind that closed roads and buried fences and made a man understand exactly how much distance existed between him and the nearest other human being. He thought about their supplies. 43 days, generously counted. He'd done the arithmetic 3 different times, hoping one of the calculations would come out different from the others. They never did. "Rope and candles," he said. "Rope and candles," May confirmed. "And we go back tomorrow." "We go back tomorrow." He nodded slowly and looked out the window at the mountains and tried to believe that whatever was inside that crack in the cliff was going to be enough. It was the same thing he'd been trying to believe since April, if he was honest. The belief kept being necessary. That was the hard part. You couldn't do it once and be done. You had to do it every morning. He lay awake that night for a long time. The house was small, 1 main room and a sleeping area partitioned off by a curtain May had brought from Ohio, pale blue cotton with small white flowers that looked absolutely absurd against the rough-hewn walls and still made him glad every time he saw it. May was asleep on her side, her breathing slow and even, doing that thing she did where she fell asleep like a person who'd decided to, deliberately, efficiently. Silas stared at the ceiling. He was not a man given to large feelings. He'd been raised to be practical, to deal with what was in front of him and not borrow trouble from the future. But tonight, in the dark, with the wind outside and 43 days of food in the root cellar and 11 geese apparently living a secret life in a mountain, he felt something he couldn't quite name. Not hope, exactly. More like the feeling just before hope. The moment when the door might open, when something might be possible that hadn't been possible before. The moment that was, if he was being honest with himself, the most dangerous feeling in the world. Because hope that collapsed took pieces of you with it. He thought about the warmth that had come from that crack in the cliff, steady and mineral and ancient, the sound of geese resting in the dark. He thought about May saying before we do anything with it, "I want to understand it." He thought about the thermometer reading in the morning, which had been 31 degrees, 11 geese, 43 days, 1 crack in a cliff face that breathed warm air. He made himself stop calculating and just listen to the wind until sleep finally came. 3 houses down the valley, down being a relative term, in a landscape where houses were separated by miles rather than lots. A man named Garrett Hoyle was doing his own arithmetic. Garrett had been in Wyoming for 6 years, long enough to know what a hard winter looked like from 50 yards away. And what he was looking at right now had all the markings. His cattle were restless. His hay stores were low, and his nearest neighbor to the east, Old Peterson, had confided just last week that he was thinking about taking his family south before the passes closed. Garrett wasn't the kind of man who took families south. He was the kind of man who stayed, sometimes out of courage, and sometimes out of stubbornness, and sometimes because he simply couldn't afford to go anywhere else. He'd noticed the new couple in the valley, the young Rowans with their 40 acres of rock and their small flock of geese and their Ohio earnestness that showed in everything from the way they built their fence to the way they looked at the mountains, like the mountains were something to be understood rather than endured. They won't make it through March, he'd thought, the first time he'd ridden past their place. Standing now at his own window, looking at the same pewter sky that Silas had looked at that morning, Garrett Hoyle revised that opinion slightly. He thought about the girl especially, the way she'd looked at him when he'd ridden past, assessing and quiet, the kind of look that made you feel like you'd been measured, and the measurement was being kept for later use. Maybe, he revised, maybe they'll make it. Outside, the wind was already making promises the sky would keep. The following morning, Silas and May went back to the mountain with a rope, 4 candles, a tinderbox, and enough sense between them to know that whatever they found on the other side of that crack might change everything. Whether it would change it for better or worse was the question that neither of them put into words, because some questions are the kind you have to answer by walking forward rather than by talking. The juniper smelled sharp in the cold. The geese had come through here an hour earlier, and their tracks were still visible in the thin skin of frost on the stone, small, purposeful, already ahead of whatever was coming. May went first. Silas followed and pulled the rope tight in his hands and went into the dark. The crack in the cliff was exactly 3 feet wide at the base, and Silas discovered this by trying to walk through it sideways and getting his coat caught on both sides simultaneously. "Turn your shoulders," May said from ahead of him, her voice already slightly muffled by stone. "I know how to turn my shoulders." "Then do it faster. There's a draft back here." He torqued himself through and nearly stumbled into her, catching himself with one hand against the rock wall. The stone was cool under his palm. Not cold the way the outside air was cold, but the deeper, steadier cool of something that had never been warm to begin with and had no intentions of changing. His eyes were still adjusting. May had gotten her candle lit already, and the small flame threw wavering yellow light against walls that narrowed and then opened and then narrowed again. Like the mountain had started to make up its mind about something and then kept revising. They were in a passage, not a cave yet, just a throat of rock, maybe 15 feet long, angled slightly downward. Silas could hear the geese now, clearer than before, not the panicked honking of disturbed birds, but the low settled sound of animals that were somewhere they wanted to be. "Give me a candle," he said. May produced one from her coat pocket, and he lit it off hers. The double light pushed the shadows back another foot or two. The walls were smooth in places where water had once moved through here, in some other geological era when this mountain had been arranged differently. There were places where the rock had fractured along horizontal lines and left narrow ledges, too small for a person, exactly the right size for a bird to stand on. They moved forward together, May's hand on the wall for balance on the downward slope, Silas's rope hanging loose from his left fist, because there was nothing to tie it to yet. Then the passage ended. Not in a wall, in an opening. Silas stepped through behind May and stopped, and for a moment he forgot about the cold and the 43 days of food and the unrepaired fence and the boot that needed resoling. He forgot about all of it, because the chamber he was standing in had no room in it for any of that. It was enormous. That was the first thing, and it kept being the thing. The scale of it refused to settle into something his brain could comfortably categorize. His candle lit maybe 20 feet of it, and beyond that was more darkness, and the darkness had a quality to it that suggested continuation rather than walls. The ceiling rose above them in a dome shape, gray-brown rock studded with mineral deposits that caught the candlelight and threw back small, cold sparkles. The floor was uneven, but not chaotic, rising and falling in low shelves of stone, and in every low shelf, in every natural depression, in every crack and ledge and hollow that the rock offered. Geese. Hundreds of them. Maybe more. Nestled into the stone in that particular compact shape birds make when they are completely at ease, heads tucked, eyes half closed, the occasional small adjustment of a wing. Their own 11 birds were among them somewhere, indistinguishable from the rest, already absorbed into the collective warmth and quiet of the place. May made a sound beside him. Not a word. Just a sound, soft and involuntary, the kind that comes out when language isn't fast enough. "May," Silas said quietly, "are those eggs?" Her voice was almost a whisper. "Look at the nesting areas." He looked. Along the lower shelves of stone, among the settled birds, he could see the pale oval shapes, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, if the flock extended as deep into the chamber as he suspected it did. Goose eggs, large and smooth, nestled against the rock with the casual abundance of something that had been accumulating here for a long time. Longer than they'd been in Wyoming. Longer, maybe, than anyone had been in Wyoming. "How long has this been here?" he said, not really asking May, just needing to say it. "Long enough," she said. She moved forward carefully, each step placed deliberately so as not to disturb the nearer birds. They watched her but didn't startle, and that more than anything told Silas something important about this place. Wild geese did not let people walk among them. These birds were behaving like they were in their territory, and the humans were the guests, which was, he supposed, accurate. May crouched near the first occupied nesting shelf and held her candle close without touching anything. She was looking at the eggs with the focused attention she usually reserved for reading, or for doing the household accounts, or for conversations she wanted to remember exactly. Silas moved deeper into the chamber, slowly. The air remained that same steady temperature, warmer than outside, cooler than a room with a fire. That mineral middle ground that seemed to belong to the rock itself. He noticed the floor near the passage entrance was dry. He noticed that the air, while close, was not stale. There was movement in it, very subtle, the kind of movement that meant the chamber breathed somehow, connected to the outside through channels too small to see. He held his candle flame still and watched it. The tiniest lean, consistent, directional. Ventilation, natural and accidental and perfect. He walked the perimeter as best he could, stepping carefully around roosting birds who regarded him with mild suspicion but no alarm, until he had a rough sense of the dimensions. 50 feet wide, maybe 70 deep, possibly more where the far wall curved away into shadow. The ceiling's dome shape was doing something useful with the temperature, trapping the warmth that rose from the packed bodies of several hundred birds and cycling it back down again. The birds were, in effect, heating the space, and the space was, in effect, keeping the eggs at a temperature that was... He stopped. He went back to where May was still crouching, still studying. "May," he said, "the temperature in here." "I was thinking the same thing." She straightened up slowly. "It's consistent. The eggs aren't frozen." "No. But it's cold enough that they're preserved," May said, "or close to it. The ones that have been abandoned, anyway." She looked at the nesting shelf in front of her. "This one. This bird is still sitting, but over there." She gestured toward a section of stone where the shelf was wider and shallower, and where several eggs sat without any bird in attendance. "Those have been left. The bird moved on, or..." She didn't finish the sentence. "The point is, in this temperature, with the air moving the way it is, they'd keep a long time." Silas did the arithmetic. He couldn't help it. "How many eggs do you think are in this chamber?" "I'm not counting today." "I'm not asking you to count, I'm asking you to estimate." "Silas." Her tone was the same one she'd used the day before, the one that made him feel about 12 years old. "We are not making plans about this today. We are looking. We are learning. That is all we are doing today." He wanted to push back, but he looked around at the chamber, at the hundreds of birds, the accumulated eggs, the ancient stone that had been doing this quietly for longer than anyone had been paying attention, and he understood what she was getting at. The room had a particular feeling to it, the feeling of a thing that had worked perfectly well without anyone's help and might not survive the wrong kind of help. "All right," he said, "we look." They spent 2 hours in the chamber that first day. May used the stub of a pencil she kept in her coat pocket and the inside of her left forearm. She'd forgotten to bring paper, which would bother her later, to scratch notes about the layout, the bird behavior, the temperature differentials between the entrance passage and the deeper areas of the chamber. She counted the visible abandoned eggs with a quiet precision, tallying in groups of 5, pausing when birds shifted or when the candlelight wavered too much to see clearly. Silas explored the far reaches of the chamber, where the dome ceiling dropped lower and the shelves became denser, and the bird population was even more compact. He found the ventilation source near the back wall, 2 narrow vertical cracks in the rock, maybe an inch wide each, through which a thin thread of outside air moved continuously. He found a place where an underground spring had once flowed, long ago, leaving behind a shallow depression in the floor that was perfectly smooth and would hold water if it ever chose to return. He found, near the eastern wall, a section of stone that was warmer than the rest, subtly but distinctly, and he pressed his palm against it and held it there for a while and thought about what that might mean about what lay deeper in the mountain. He didn't say anything about that one yet. When they came back out through the passage and into the cold Wyoming morning, the contrast was almost violent. The air bit at the exposed skin of Silas's face, and he squinted against the gray light. And May stood beside him, with her pencil notes on her forearm and her eyes slightly unfocused, the way they went when she was processing. "We can't tell anyone," she said. He hadn't expected that to be the first thing out of her mouth, but as soon as she said it, he understood it. "No," he agreed. "Not yet. Maybe not for a while." She looked at him directly. "You know what happens if word gets out that there's a chamber full of eggs in this mountain?" He did know. He didn't want to think about it, but he knew. A place like this, in a valley that was already starting to worry about the winter, would not stay private for long once a single person knew. And there were people in this valley, not bad people, not evil people, just frightened people, which was in some ways worse, who would take every egg in that chamber in a week and be back the following week for whatever was left. And inside of a month there would be nothing left but empty stone and disturbed birds, and a vacancy where something extraordinary had been. "We keep it between us," he said. May nodded, but she was still looking at the junipers, at the curtain of branches that hid the entrance. "We need to be able to get in there more easily," she said. "That passage is—" She gestured at her coat, which had 2 fresh tears in it from the stone. "We can't be doing this every time. And we can't be wasting candles every morning just to check on things. We'd have to widen the entrance without disturbing the birds." He thought about that. The entrance crack was close enough to the main opening that the geese were accustomed to it, were comfortable moving through it. Any significant work near that entrance would mean noise, vibration, the smell of human effort. "We'd have to do it slow," he said. "A little at a time." "Very little at a time." She pulled her coat tighter. "Silas, I've been thinking that's always either very good news or very bad news." She ignored him. "The eggs that are already abandoned, the ones with no birds sitting on them. If we took those, only the ones that have genuinely been left, would we be disturbing the ecosystem, or would we just be cleaning up?" Silas said. "I was going to say participating, carefully." She looked at him. "The way you're supposed to participate in something you didn't create and have no right to ruin." He turned that over in his mind. It was a careful distinction, the difference between harvesting what was already given and taking what hadn't been offered. May made that kind of distinction naturally, instinctively, and he was never quite sure whether it came from practicality or something deeper that she'd never had language for. Either way, she was usually right. "We'd need a system," he said. "Yes. We'd need to mark which eggs we'd checked, which ones were genuinely abandoned versus temporarily unattended. You can't just... You'd have to observe long enough to know the difference." 3 days minimum, May said, "for any given egg. Watch it for 3 days, mark it if it's still unattended, then collect it on the 4th. That's a lot of trips." "Yes, and we'd need a way to transport them that doesn't..." He thought about the terrain between here and the homestead, the loose rock on the slope, the dry creek bed that ran through gravel that shifted underfoot. "A sled," he said slowly. "Something low to the ground, steady, not a basket, basket's tip." "Can you build a sled?" "I can build a sled." He paused. "It might not be pretty." "I don't care if it's pretty." He looked at her, at the pencil notes on her forearm, already starting to smear in the cold, at the tear in her coat that she'd noticed and was already calculating how to repair, at the set of her jaw that meant she'd decided something and was now in the process of executing it, and would not stop until it was done or it was impossible. And sometimes not even then. He thought about the chamber, about the warmth of it, and the quiet, and the hundreds of birds that had been doing this, had been using that space, protecting those eggs, running their own ancient and perfectly functional operation without any human involvement whatsoever. And now here were 2 humans, standing in the cold outside of it, trying to figure out how to be useful without being destructive. It struck him suddenly as a very small problem and a very large one at the same time. "We need to map it properly," he said. "The whole chamber. I think I found a warm section in the eastern wall that might mean..." "One thing at a time," May said. "A warm section in the rock could mean..." "Silas." She started walking back down the slope toward the homestead, picking her way carefully over the loose stone. One thing at a time. He stood there for another moment, looking at the junipers, thinking about what was behind them. Then he followed her down. Over the next 5 days, they went back every morning and stayed 2 to 3 hours, which was roughly how long their candle supply allowed without starting to compromise their evening light at home. May brought paper the second day and transferred her arm notes properly, then added to them. She developed a mapping system using compass bearings and her own pacing as a unit of measurement, one of her paces being approximately 2.5 feet, which she verified by measuring it against a known distance at the homestead before committing to it as a standard. The map took shape across 3 sheets of paper that she pinned to the wall above the kitchen table and studied every evening. She labeled the nesting zones with letters. She marked the ventilation cracks. She marked the warm section of wall that Silas had found, labeled it with a question mark, because neither of them knew what it meant, and she was disciplined about keeping uncertainty as uncertainty rather than promoting it to fact. Silas, meanwhile, began the work on the passage entrance. He did it carefully, the way May had specified, a little at a time, always stopping before the bird showed any sign of disturbance. He used a small chisel and a piece of wood wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound, and he worked in short sessions, never more than 15 minutes at a stretch, and only when the geese had already settled into the chamber and weren't moving. It was slow work. After 5 days, the passage was perhaps 2 inches wider at its narrowest point, and Silas's right shoulder ached continuously, and he'd chipped his second-best chisel. May noticed the shoulder. She didn't say anything directly, but she started putting the liniment on the shelf where he could reach it without having to ask, which was her particular way of acknowledging something without making it a conversation. On the 6th day, they began identifying the abandoned eggs systematically. May numbered them with a small mark of coal, nothing that would harm the shell, she'd verified that first, so they could track which ones remained unattended across multiple visits. The discipline of it was harder than Silas had expected. There were eggs he wanted to pick up immediately, eggs that had clearly been sitting alone for longer than 3 days, but May held the system firm. You marked it on the day you first found it unattended. You came back the next day and checked. You came back the day after that. Only on the 4th day, if the egg remained unclaimed, if no bird had returned to it, did you collect it. It felt inefficient to him. It also felt correct, in a way he couldn't articulate, and he'd learned by now to trust that feeling. The weather turned worse in the middle of that first week. The temperature dropped another 8 degrees and stayed there, and a wind came through the valley from the northwest that had real intent behind it, the kind of wind that finds every gap in a wall and every thin place in a coat and makes itself known. Silas spent an afternoon reinforcing the chinks in their walls with a mixture of clay and dry grass that he wasn't entirely confident would hold but was better than nothing. That evening, sitting at the table with the lamp low and the map spread out between them, May said, "I think we counted correctly." "Which count?" "The abandoned eggs. The ones we've marked so far." She put her finger on the map, on the section she'd labeled Zone C, where the nesting shelves were widest and the bird density was highest. If the whole chamber holds to the same ratio, abandoned to sitting, then by midwinter we might have enough preserved eggs to... She stopped. To what? She looked up from the map. She had a particular expression that Silas had seen maybe 4 or 5 times in the 2 years they'd been married. An expression that was not quite hope and not quite fear, but sat in the exact place where those 2 things met. "Silas, what is the worst thing that can happen to this valley in the next 3 months?" He knew the answer without having to think about it. "People run out of food." "Yes." She kept looking at him. "And if that happens," he thought about Peterson, thinking about taking his family south. He thought about Garrett Hoyle, who had 6 years in this valley and wasn't the kind of man who left, but whose hay stores were low. He thought about the Lindqvist family at the northern end of the valley, who had 4 children and a 5th on the way, and a husband who'd broken 2 ribs in September, falling off a roof he'd been trying to repair before winter. "People leave," he said, "or people don't make it through." May looked back at the map. "I'm not saying we tell anyone," she said carefully. "Not yet. I'm not saying anything changes about how we manage the chamber, but I want us to think about it as a possibility. Not today, not this week, but eventually." Silas looked at the map, at the careful letters and the question mark over the warm section, and the little coal mark numbers that May had tracked in a separate column on a piece of paper to the right of the main drawing. "One thing at a time," he said. She almost smiled. "One thing at a time." Outside, the wind was doing something that sounded like it was testing the walls, running its fingers along the seams, finding out what held. The lamp on the table burned steady. The map spread between them, precise and incomplete, like all honest maps of unknown territory. Neither of them slept easily that night, and for once it wasn't the cold that kept them awake. What kept them awake was the growing understanding that they had found something that was larger than them, and that being responsible for something larger than yourself is one of the loneliest, most necessary feelings in the world. The sled took Silas 4 days to build and looked, when finished, like something that had lost an argument with a woodpile. May walked around it twice without saying anything, which was either a good sign or a very bad one. The runners were uneven. The left one sat a 1/4 inch lower than the right, which Silas had tried to correct twice and made worse both times. The bed was solid enough, built from the straightest planks he'd been able to cut from the small store of lumber they'd been saving for a floor addition come spring. He'd padded it with burlap stuffed with dry grass, which would compress under weight and provide some cushioning against the rocky terrain between the mountain and the homestead. "It'll work," May said finally. "The left runner will work fine in snow." She crouched and looked at the runner in question. "It's uneven on flat ground, but snow will compensate. The drag will even out." Silas looked at it skeptically. He'd built things before that May had declared functional, and she'd been right more often than not. But there was something about this particular sled that bothered him in a way he couldn't entirely pin down. Maybe it was that so much depended on it now. It was the first week of November. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 18 degrees overnight and come back up to 27 by noon, which was not a recovery so much as a negotiation. The first real snow had come 3 days ago. Not the killing kind yet, just 4 inches that turned the valley white and quiet, and reminded everyone exactly where they were and what time of year it was becoming. They had collected, as of that morning, 61 eggs. 61 eggs across 11 trips to the chamber, following May's 4-day observation system with a discipline that had cost Silas more than he'd expected. There had been mornings when he'd stood in the chamber looking at an egg that had clearly been sitting alone for 5 or 6 days. Any fool could see it was abandoned. And May had checked her coal mark numbering and said that one was first marked 3 days ago, not 4, and he had left it there. And he had not complained out loud about it, mostly because complaining out loud had proven, over the course of his marriage, to be approximately as useful as complaining to a fence post. 61 eggs sat in the root cellar now, wrapped individually in dry cloth and packed into 2 wooden crates that May had recushioned twice when she wasn't satisfied with how the eggs were settling. They were cool in the root cellar, but not frozen, which was exactly where May wanted them. She had also, in those same 11 days, completed the map. It covered 2 full sheets of paper now, front and back, and it was the most detailed document either of them had ever produced. Every nesting zone was labeled and dimensioned, every ventilation crack was marked, and its airflow direction indicated with a small arrow. The warm section of eastern wall had its own notation. Possible geothermal activity. Investigate further when weather permits. The passage entrance was marked with a dotted line indicating the original width and a solid line indicating current width, with a note: passage widened 4.5 inches over 14 sessions. Birds show no disturbance response. Along the margins, May had written observations about bird behavior, which zones were most densely populated, which shelves seemed to be preferred for laying versus sleeping, which areas of the chamber the geese avoided entirely, and why she thought they might. It was, Silas thought, the work of someone who took things seriously in a way that most people didn't understand until they saw the results. He told her that once, approximately, in different words, after she'd reorganized their supply system in August in a way that had initially seemed overcomplicated and had subsequently saved them from running out of lamp oil a month earlier than expected. "I just pay attention," she'd said, which was true the way it's true to say a master carpenter just puts wood together. The morning after Silas finished the sled, they tested it on the slope. They loaded it with river stones to approximate the weight of a reasonable egg collection. May had calculated this out on paper, factoring in the weight of the padding and the empty crates, and walked it up the slope to the juniper curtain, and then walked it back down. The left runner was indeed compensated by the uneven ground, and the sled tracked reasonably straight on the descent without requiring constant correction. It was slow. The padded bed absorbed the small shocks of the rocky terrain without, as far as they could tell, disturbing the stone cargo in ways that would have disturbed eggs. "Good enough," Silas said. "We need a better braking system for when it's icy. I'll add a drag rope. 2 drag ropes. 1 on each side so we can steer." He looked at her. "Did you already design the drag rope system?" "I thought about it a little." "In your head or on paper?" She reached into her coat pocket and produced a small folded piece of paper. He took it, unfolded it, looked at the sketch on it. She'd drawn the sled from above with 2 rope positions indicated and angles marked. "May," he said. "What?" "Nothing." He folded the paper back and handed it to her. "I'll add the ropes this afternoon." What he didn't say, because he didn't have the exact words for it, and she would have deflected from it anyway, was that he was watching his wife become someone in those weeks. Not that she hadn't been someone before, but there's a particular kind of person who only comes fully into themselves when a problem is large enough and real enough and serious enough to require everything they have. And May Rowan, it was becoming clear, was that kind of person. The chamber had given her something to be serious about, and she was being serious about it with everything she had. It scared him a little, the way good things sometimes do when you understand how much you'd lose if they ended. The drag ropes went on that afternoon. He added them exactly where her sketch indicated, because her sketch was correct. Through November, they established what May called a rhythm, though rhythm implied a smoothness that the actual work rarely had. Every morning, they went to the chamber. Every trip, they checked the marked eggs and updated the tally, collected any that had reached day 4 of abandonment, noted any new abandoned eggs for the marking cycle. Silas continued the slow widening of the passage. By the 2nd week of November, it was 5 inches wider than when they'd started, and he could now move through it without getting his coat torn, which he considered a significant quality of life improvement. May began what she called a behavioral log, which was a daily record of anything that changed in the chamber, which nesting zones were more or less occupied, whether the total bird count seemed to be shifting, whether the bird arrivals and departures were changing with the weather outside. She was looking for patterns, she said, because she wanted to understand the natural cycle well enough not to accidentally disrupt it. "We need to know when they stop laying," she explained one evening, the log open on the table beside the map. "If there's a season to it, if the egg production changes through winter." "Does it matter? If we're only taking abandoned ones?" "It matters because if we don't understand the cycle, we might misread an abandoned egg. A bird that's pausing between clutches isn't the same as a bird that's left for good." She tapped the log. "If we can understand the pattern, we can be more accurate." Silas looked at the log. She'd filled 3 pages in 8 days. "You know, most people who found a cave full of eggs would just take the eggs. Most people who found a cave full of eggs would empty it by Christmas and have nothing by February." He didn't have an argument for that, because it was true. The hardest part of those November weeks was not the physical work, though the physical work was genuinely hard. The slope to the mountain was demanding in the cold, and the passage work was cramped and tedious, and carrying the sled back up empty after each delivery run made Silas's shoulders burn in a way that the liniment on the shelf helped only moderately. The hardest part was the silence, not the silence of the chamber, that he'd come to appreciate, even depend on. The silence of not being able to tell anyone. It expressed itself in small, uncomfortable moments. The Sunday in early November when Garrett Hoyle rode past and stopped to exchange weather observations and mentioned that his feed stores were running lower than expected, and looked at Silas with the particular look of a man who is not quite asking for help but is letting the door open. And Silas had said something about feed prices in Cheyenne and changed the subject, and watched Hoyle ride away and felt a specific kind of guilty discomfort that sat between his shoulder blades for the rest of the day. Or the morning May had ridden into the nearest town for supplies, a 6-hour round trip that she'd done alone because Silas needed to finish a section of wall repair, and had come back tight-lipped and said that Mrs. Peterson in the dry goods store had been crying quietly at the back counter and trying to hide it. And the shopkeeper had told May that the Peterson family was genuinely considering leaving before December. 4 children, May had said that evening, not looking at him. The youngest is 8 months old. Silas hadn't said anything. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't have led somewhere neither of them was ready to go. The tension between the secret and the knowledge of what the secret could do, that was the weight that November put on them. Heavier than the cold, heavier than the work. They'd agreed to keep it. They'd agreed for good reasons. But good reasons don't make weight lighter. They just make it necessary to carry. What broke the stasis in the end was not a dramatic moment. It was an egg. Specifically, it was an egg that Silas found on November 19th, on a section of nesting shelf in Zone F that he'd been checking less regularly because it was in a far corner of the chamber and the bird density was lower there. The egg had no coal mark on it. He'd walked past it 4 times without marking it because on each of those 4 visits, he'd seen what he thought was a bird nearby, or assumed there was, in the poor candlelight, in the crowded and shifting population of the chamber. But when he crouched close to it that morning and held his candle steady, the egg was cold. Not cold the way an egg gets after a few hours alone. Cold the way something gets when it's been abandoned long enough to fully surrender to the ambient temperature of the room. It had been there, unclaimed, for longer than 4 days. Considerably longer. He sat back on his heels and looked at it. He thought about May's system, the mark and wait protocol that required him to notate the first day of confirmed abandonment and return 3 more times before collecting. By that standard, this egg, already definitively abandoned, already cold, should have been collected a week ago if he'd been watching it properly. He hadn't been watching it properly. He'd missed it. He picked it up carefully and held it and felt the weight of it, which was substantial, and the temperature of it, which told him everything he needed to know about its viability, and he put it in the collection bag and stood up and walked back to where May was working in Zone B. "I found a cold one," he said. She looked up. "Where?" "Zone F. Far corner. I missed it somehow." He paused. "May, it was cold all the way through. It's been abandoned a long time." She didn't say "I told you so" or "that's why the system matters" or anything that would have been technically accurate, but not what he needed in that moment. She just looked at him evenly and said, "How far into the corner?" "Past the big shelf, where the ceiling drops. We need to extend the check pattern to cover that section more consistently." "I know." He looked at the bag where the egg was. "We're also, May, we're falling behind where we could be with the collection. The 4-day system is right, but we're not covering the whole chamber systematically. We're missing things." She was quiet for a moment. Around them birds shuffled and settled, the low background sound of the chamber that had become as familiar to them as the sound of wind in their own chimney. "What do you suggest?" she said. He'd been thinking about it on the walk over from Zone F. "We divide the chamber. Like your zones, but more formal. Each zone gets its own dedicated check day. We rotate through them, same order, same timing. Nothing gets checked less than every other day." May considered this. That means more trips. Or longer trips. We stay in here 2 hours instead of 1.5. The candles. We can render down the tallow from... He stopped, did a quick calculation. "We've got enough fat from the last 2 geese to add another 40 minutes of candle time per day if we're careful about the wicks." She looked at the zone map she kept folded in her pocket, unfolded it, studied it. He watched her eyes move across the paper, making adjustments in her head. She had the map memorized. He was fairly sure of that, but she liked having it in front of her anyway, the way some people like to see a problem written down even when they already know the answer. "All right," she said, "but we need to recheck Zone F entirely first. Mark everything fresh, start the clock again on anything that's been abandoned." "Agreed." "And Silas." She looked up from the map. "If you're not sure whether a bird is sitting or just nearby, mark it. Mark it and come back, even if it costs us a day's collection." He nodded. "I know. I'm not..." She paused. "I'm not criticizing you. I missed things too. In Zone D last week, there was I thought I counted 17 birds on the eastern shelf. I went back and counted again yesterday, and there were 14. Either I miscounted or 3 birds shifted zones and I didn't note it." She folded the map. "We're both learning." That was true. That was the particular truth of all of November, that they were learning something nobody had taught them, and there was no manual for it. And every mistake they made was a mistake they'd made in a place they were trying not to damage, which was a specific kind of pressure that made ordinary mistakes feel heavier than they deserved to. The revised zone system went into effect the following day. May renumbered the zones on the map, expanding from 6 to 9 to account for the corners and lower shelves that had been informally included in larger zones before. She assigned each a day in a rotating cycle and wrote the rotation on a separate card that Silas kept in his coat pocket, and she kept a copy of above the kitchen table next to the map. It was, Silas thought, the most organized he had ever been about anything in his life, which was slightly alarming since most of the organization had been May's idea. The practical effect was immediate. In the first week under the new system, they collected 44 eggs, nearly as many as they'd collected in the entire previous 3 weeks combined. Not because there were more abandoned eggs, but because they were actually finding them. The chamber was yielding what it had always been willing to yield. They'd just finally gotten thorough enough to receive it. Their total count crossed 120 on a Wednesday morning in late November, and Silas noted the number in the log while May was checking Zone G and then sat with it for a moment. 120 preserved goose eggs. He did the arithmetic. He couldn't stop himself. He'd been doing it in the back of his head since October. 1 egg fed a person adequately for a meal. At that rate, with careful rationing, 120 eggs fed a family of 4 for 30 days, or 3 families for 10 days each. Or if you were thinking about a whole valley that was looking at a winter that showed no signs of mercy. He stopped calculating when he heard May's boots on the chamber floor coming back from Zone G. 47 in the zone, she said. 8 new to mark. 2 ready to collect. She stopped when she saw his expression. What? We're over 120. She sat down on the low shelf across from him, not on the bird side, on the clear stone section they'd started using as a kind of work area, smoothed slightly by their own repeated sitting. She was quiet for a moment. The candles threw their shadows large against the dome ceiling. I've been doing the math, she said finally, in my head, at night. So have I. And I think we already know what we're going to do with them, he said. We're just not saying it yet. May looked at her hands, which were rough now, in a way they hadn't been in Ohio, cracked at the knuckles, permanently carrying the faint gray of the mountain's mineral dust, regardless of how carefully she washed. She'd stopped being upset about that sometime in October. The Peterson family, she said, and Hoyle, and the Lindqvists. We can't do it openly. If we show up with 100 eggs and people start asking where they came from, we don't have to explain everything, Silas said. We just have to deliver food. May looked up at him. And when they ask? Hoyle especially, he'll ask. He's not the kind of man who takes something without wanting to understand where it came from. Then we tell him we've been managing our flock more carefully than expected, and we have surplus. He met her eyes. Which is true. It's not the whole truth. No. He was quiet for a moment. May, I'm not talking about lying to people. I'm talking about when a person is hungry enough that their children are at risk, you don't make them sit through a full explanation before you feed them. She was silent long enough that the candle nearest her burned down a 1/4 inch. 3 families, she said finally. To start, quietly. No announcement, no, we just go. We knock on the door and we leave what we have and we deal with the questions later. And if people figure it out, then people figure it out. She stood up, dusted the stone dust from her coat. But the chamber comes before the secret. Protecting that comes first. Anyone who learns about it has to understand that before they learn anything else. Silas looked up at the dome ceiling, at the shadows moving in the candlelight, at the hundreds of birds making their low, steady sounds in the dark. This place had existed for longer than anyone now alive had been alive. It had been doing what it did, providing what it provided, without anyone's interference or oversight or protection. And now it had 2 people who knew about it, who were trying very hard to be the right kind of knowing. The weight of that had not gotten lighter. It had gotten more familiar, which was different. You got used to the shape of it, the way you got used to the shape of a tool that fit imperfectly in your hand. Not comfortable, just known. He stood up too, picked up the collection bag, checked that the padding was adequate, began the slow walk back toward the passage. Silas, May said from behind him. He stopped. We're not going to get this perfect, she said. Whatever we decide, however we do it, we're going to make mistakes. I know. I just want to say that out loud before we go further, so neither of us is surprised when it happens. He turned around and looked at her in the candlelight, in this underground place that had become, in the space of 6 weeks, more familiar to him than almost anywhere he'd ever lived. She was right. They were going to make mistakes. They already had, and there would be more. Okay, he said. We know that. Now let's go home. The passage out was easier than it had been, wider now, the stone walls no longer grabbing at their coats. Silas had done that, one careful inch at a time, over the course of weeks. Not perfect, not fast, but changed slightly toward something more workable. The cold outside hit them like it always did. That familiar assault of Wyoming November, the air that had no interest in your comfort or your plans. They walked home in silence, and the sled's left runner tracked slightly low on the uneven ground, and snow was coming. It was all around them in the quality of the air, in the particular shade of gray the sky had turned. Not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. The valley below them lay quiet and ordinary-looking, scattered with homesteads whose smoke rose straight up in the still air. Hoyle's place to the south, the Peterson land to the east, the distant Lindqvist buildings barely visible at the valley's north end. People inside all of them doing the same arithmetic that everyone in a hard place does in the weeks before a hard winter. Silas looked at the valley and then looked away and followed his wife down the slope toward home, and thought about how you know when the time for waiting is over. The snow came on a Thursday, not the polite kind that arrives gradually and gives you time to prepare. The kind that comes in overnight while you're sleeping and has already made its decisions by the time you open the door in the morning and find the world has been replaced with a different one. Silas opened the door at 5:45, and the cold hit him so hard he actually stepped back into the house, and May looked up from the stove and said, "How bad?" He and he said, "Bad." And that was the full extent of the conversation for a while. 2 feet by noon. The kind of accumulation that changed the mathematics of everything. The path to the mountain was gone. Not permanently, but functionally, for that day at least, maybe 2. The slope that they'd walked every morning for 6 weeks had become something else entirely, a white expanse that looked deceptively manageable and was not. Silas knew this because he tried it after breakfast and made it perhaps a third of the way up before his left foot punched through a snow crust into empty air over a rock shelf, and he went down hard on his right knee and sat there for a moment taking inventory of his body while the cold worked its way through his pants. He came back to the house limping slightly and told May the path was impassable. "The geese got up there," she said. She was at the window, watching. The geese, their 11, who had apparently decided Wyoming winter was not their problem, had disappeared into the white slope an hour ago with the same calm purpose they always had. "The geese weigh 12 pounds and have 4 feet, Silas said. "I weigh 170 and have 2, and one of my knees currently disagrees with the entire concept of stairs." May almost smiled. "Sit down, I'll look at it." His knee was bruised, not damaged, which was good news delivered with enough pain to feel like bad news. May wrapped it with a strip of cloth and told him to stay off it for the afternoon, which he agreed to in theory and ignored in practice because there was stock to feed and water to haul and a dozen other things that a bruised knee didn't make optional. They spent that first day of serious winter doing what you do, making sure the animals that depended on them were warm enough and fed enough to make it to the next morning. It was not glamorous work. It never was. But by the time the light failed at 4:30 and they were back inside with the lamp burning and the stove doing its honest best against the cold that pressed against every wall, they were intact. 209 eggs, May said, consulting the log. She kept it updated every evening, the day's collection and running total, noted in the same precise hand, plus whatever was ready to collect today that we didn't get to. "We'll make it up tomorrow if the path is passable." "It'll be passable." She closed the log. "Silas, I've been thinking about the Petersons." He'd been thinking about the Petersons too, though he hadn't said so. The last time he'd seen Arvid Peterson, the man had looked like someone who was being very deliberate about not showing how worried he was, which in Silas's experience was a more honest display of fear than actual visible panic. Arvid was a careful, contained kind of man who had come to Wyoming from Minnesota 4 years ago and built his homestead with a methodical competence that Silas genuinely admired. He had 4 children. His wife was small and steady and had never once, in Silas's observation, complained about anything. The baby was 9 months old now. "What about them?" Silas said, though he knew. "We have 209 eggs," May said. "We need 50 for ourselves, realistically, to get through to March. Maybe 60 to be safe. That leaves 149. 159 if we're less conservative about our own share. Which we should be. She looked at him directly. Silas, we're not the ones with 4 children. He leaned back in his chair, which creaked the way it always did because he'd never quite gotten the joinery right on the back left leg. If we show up at the Peterson place with eggs, Arvid is going to ask questions. You know that. Yes. He's not going to just take charity. I know. So what do we tell him? May picked up her coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. We tell him the truth, she said. Enough of the truth. We tell him we've been managing our flock carefully, and we have more than we need, and we'd rather they go to use than sit in our cellar. And if he asks where we're getting so many from 11 geese, then we tell him we found a winter nesting site in the mountain that's been keeping the flock productive. She met his eyes. Which is true. And if he wants to see it? That was the question that had been sitting between them for 3 weeks, ever since they'd first started talking about sharing what they had. They'd circled it, approached it, backed away from it. It was the hinge point of everything. May was quiet for a moment. Then we take him, she said finally. But we go first, alone. And we explain what it is and what it isn't. And we make him understand before he sets foot inside that chamber that it only stays what it is if it's treated like what it is. And if he doesn't agree to those terms, Arvid Peterson, May said carefully, is the kind of man who builds fences before he needs them and fixes his roof in August. He's not going to disagree with us about protecting something that works. Silas thought about this. She was probably right about Arvid. She was less certainly right about everyone else, and everyone else was what he was thinking about when he thought about the secret getting out. Arvid was responsible. Garrett Hoyle was responsible. The Lindqvists were good people by every measure he'd seen. But good people in desperate circumstances could become different people. And he'd seen enough of the valley this autumn to know that some people were closer to desperate than others. One family at a time, he said. One family at a time, May agreed. They packed the first sled load 3 days later, when the path had compacted enough to walk safely and his knee had decided to forgive him for the fall. May counted out 40 eggs, packed them in 2 crates with the burlap cushioning, and they pulled the sled together down the valley road, which was barely a road anymore, just 2 ruts beneath the snow that they navigated by memory, to the Peterson homestead. It was mid-morning when they arrived. The smoke from the chimney was thin, which told Silas something about the wood supply before they'd even knocked. Arvid answered the door, and his expression went through several things quickly. Surprise, then a careful neutrality that Silas recognized as the face of a man deciding whether he had room to feel anything yet. Silas, he said. May, come in. We won't stay, May said. We just came to bring you something. She gestured at the sled. We have more eggs than we need this season. We'd like you to have some. Arvid Peterson stood in his doorway and looked at the sled. Then he looked at May. Then at Silas. It was a long look, the kind that takes stock. That's a fair number of eggs, he said. We've been managing our flock carefully, May said. Found a site in the mountain that's kept them productive through the cold. We have surplus. Arvid was quiet. From inside the house came the sound of a child, and then his wife's voice, low and soothing. Clara's been worried, he said, not quite to them, not quite to himself. About the stores. I know, May said. I don't take charity well. It's not charity, Silas said. You do the same for us. You probably will before this winter's done. Things even out. That landed differently than Silas had expected. Something in Arvid's face shifted, not softened exactly, but unlocked. He stepped back from the door. Bring them in, he said, and have some coffee. Clara will want to thank you herself. Clara Peterson was 28 years old and had the eyes of someone 10 years older, the kind of eyes that have seen enough hard seasons to have filed away the information and moved on. She was nursing the baby when they came in and didn't stop or apologize for it, just looked up and said, 40 eggs. That's going to help a great deal, as if she'd known before they'd even unpacked the crates. Clara, Arvid said, I'm not going to pretend I don't know what 40 eggs means to us right now. She looked at May directly. Thank you. May said, we'd do it again. We probably will. They stayed for 20 minutes. The coffee was weak. The Petersons were stretching their grounds too, just like the Rowans had been in October. And the youngest Peterson child stared at Silas with the unblinking suspicion that babies reserve for faces they haven't decided about yet. By the time they left, the tightness around Arvid's eyes had eased a fraction. Not gone, but fractionally less severe. Walking back up the valley road, pulling the empty sled, Silas said, "That wasn't as complicated as I expected." "Hungry people are usually less complicated than comfortable people," May said. "Comfort gives you more room to be difficult." He thought about that for a while as they walked. The visit to Garrett Hoyle was different. Hoyle came to the door before they'd knocked, because he'd seen them coming from half a mile away. He had a habit of watching his property lines that 6 years of Wyoming had made instinctive. He was a big man, wide through the shoulders, with a gray-streaked beard that he kept trimmed in a way that suggested he hadn't entirely abandoned the idea of civilization even out here. He looked at the sled and looked at them and said, "Well," in a tone that contained a complete question. "We've got more than we need," Silas said. "Eggs," Hoyle said. "Yes, a lot of eggs for 2 people and 11 geese." "We found a mountain site," Silas said. "Keeps the flock producing through winter." Hoyle looked at him steadily, then at May, then back at Silas. "How much of that am I supposed to take as the full story?" "As much of it as you need right now," May said. "The rest can come later." "May Rowan," Hoyle said slowly, "you are either the most diplomatic person I have met in Wyoming, or the most careful one." "Probably both," she said. "Take the eggs, Garrett. Your stock needs feed money, and we both know your stores are lower than you want them. Take the eggs and we'll talk more in the spring when there's time to talk properly." Hoyle was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the mountains, at the particular section of the Laramie Range that rose behind the Rowan homestead, white now and severe against the gray sky, and something moved through his expression that Silas couldn't quite read. "How many times can you do this?" he said. "Not," he raised a hand. "I'm not asking to take advantage. I'm asking because if this is a once-off, I'll use them one way, and if this is ongoing, I'll use them differently." It was, Silas thought, exactly the right question to ask. It was the question of a man who planned. "Ongoing," May said. "Through winter, as long as the flock holds." Hoyle nodded slowly. "Then I'll take 30 now, and be sensible about them." He looked at Silas. "And in the spring, you'll tell me the rest of it." "In the spring," Silas agreed. They shook hands. Hoyle unloaded 30 eggs himself, efficiently, and offered to help pull the sled back to the road, which Silas declined. As they were leaving, Hoyle called after them. "The Lindqvists have been short since October. Bjorn's ribs haven't healed right. He can't do the work." "We know," May said without turning around. "We're going there next." The Lindqvist visit was the hardest of the 3, not because Bjorn or his wife Ingrid were difficult, but because the evidence of need there was more visible. The fence around their yard was half repaired and frozen in place that way. The woodpile was low enough to count from the road. 2 of the children were outside when Silas and May arrived, bundled in coats that were a size too small, and playing in the snow with the absorbed concentration of children who don't know yet that they're supposed to be worried. Ingrid Lindqvist opened the door and took one look at the sled and said, in her still accented English, "Come in, please. Bjorn will want to see you." Bjorn Lindqvist was sitting at his kitchen table with the careful stillness of a man whose ribs reminded him of their opinion every time he moved. He was maybe 40, fair-haired, going gray, with the look of someone who had been strong his whole life and was currently finding the experience of not being strong genuinely difficult to process. He looked at the eggs with an expression that he tried to make neutral and didn't entirely succeed. "We can't pay you," he said. "Not yet. Come spring." "We don't want payment," Silas said. "We want you to get through the winter. We're managing." "Bjorn?" Ingrid said quietly from across the room. He looked at her. Some communication passed between them that Silas couldn't hear and didn't need to. The particular silent language of 2 people who have been through enough together to develop their own shorthand. Bjorn looked back at Silas. "How?" he said. "Do you have this many eggs?" "That's a longer story," May said, from the door where she'd stayed, giving the room air. "One will tell you properly when the weather lets up. Right now, the short version is that we found something in the mountain that's been keeping our flock going, and we have more than we need, and your children need to eat." There was a silence in the kitchen that had several things in it. Pride was one of them, and Silas understood pride because he had a fair amount of it himself, and he knew what it cost to set it down. Gratitude was in there too, pressed underneath the pride, waiting. Bjorn looked at the eggs for a long moment. Then he nodded once, short and definitive, the nod of a man who has made a decision he intends to stick to. "Thank you," he said. He said it like it was something he owed, not like he was giving it freely, which meant it was the most honest kind. They left 30 eggs at the Lindqvist place and walked home in the early afternoon with the empty sled and the growing dark, and the temperature dropping in the particular way it drops in Wyoming when it means business. "That's 100, Silas said when they were halfway home. "And we've got 109 left, plus whatever we collect this week." May was walking with her head slightly down against the wind that had picked up from the north. "And the flock is still producing. For now." "For now," she agreed. They didn't talk again until they were close to home, and then May said, without preamble, "Hoyle's going to figure it out." "I know. He's too smart not to. He'll think about it. Where eggs come from, how many we'd need to give away this much and still have enough. And he'll work backward." "Probably." "When he does," May said, "I think we should tell him, all of it, before he asks." She glanced at Silas. "It'll go better if he hears it from us before he's already figured it out. Nobody likes feeling like they were managed." Silas thought about Hoyle, about the way the man had looked at the mountains when May had told him the rest would come later, the calculation behind his eyes, the settled patience of someone who was happy to wait because he was already working on the problem. "When?" he said. "Before Christmas, if the weather allows." It didn't allow for a while. The storm that came in on December 2nd was of a different order than the November snow. 3 days of continuous snowfall that piled up until the drifts against the north wall of the Rowan house were level with the windowsills, and the wind made sounds in the chimney that kept May awake the first night and Silas awake the second. They made it to the mountain on the first day, but not the second, and on the third they tried and Silas turned them around halfway up the slope when a section of snow broke loose above them and slid 20 feet downhill with a sound like paper tearing. "Not today," he said. May didn't argue. She stood on the slope and looked up toward the juniper curtain they couldn't see under the white, and then turned and came back down with him. And he knew she was doing the same mental arithmetic he was. The birds would be fine. The chamber would be fine. The temperature in there didn't change regardless of what the sky was doing outside. But knowing a thing and feeling settled about it were different operations. The collection logs showed a gap for those 3 days. May noted it with a simple dash in the day column, the way you note something that can't be helped and have to accept as a fact. When the storm broke on the 4th day and they made it back to the chamber, the geese greeted them with the usual mild indifference. The eggs were as they'd left them, and there were 14 new abandonments to mark. The chamber had done what it always did, which was exactly what it had always done, without any assistance from either of them. "It doesn't need us," Silas said, standing in the middle of the chamber with his candle, looking at the undisturbed order of it all. "That's the point," May said. "We need it, not the other way around. We just have to make sure we don't turn that the other way." In the week after the storm, they made 4 more deliveries. Not just to the 3 families they'd started with, but to 2 others. The Olson family, whose husband had written to his brother in Iowa and received no reply and was now sitting with the specific fear of someone who has stopped expecting good news, and the widow Haskell, who lived alone at the far eastern edge of the valley with a stubbornness that the whole valley admired, and a food situation that Silas had learned about indirectly through a conversation May had had with Clara Peterson, who had heard it from Ingrid Lindqvist, which was how information moved in isolated places. The widow Haskell was 71 years old, had buried 2 husbands and 3 children, and had been in Wyoming since before there was a Wyoming territory to speak of. She opened her door when Silas and May arrived and looked at the sled and said, "I was wondering when someone would get around to it." "Ma'am," Silas said, "someone doing something useful." She stood aside to let them bring the crates in. "I've been watching the smoke from your chimney all autumn, regular, even through the worst of it. Either you 2 are the most cold-blooded people in the valley, or you've sorted something out that the rest of us haven't." May set down her crate and looked at the old woman with an expression that was partly amusement and partly respect. "We got lucky," she said. The widow Haskell looked in the crate. 40 eggs. That's more than lucky." She looked up. "I won't ask, but I want you to know that I'm guessing, and I've probably guessed most of it right. And my intention with whatever I've guessed is to keep it entirely to myself." They stood in her kitchen while she made them tea that was stronger than anything Silas had drunk since leaving Ohio, And she told them about 2 previous hard winters she'd lived through in this valley, and what had gotten people through them and what hadn't. She talked about community the way someone talks about a tool, practically, with specific examples of where it worked and where it failed and what the failure mode looked like. The worst thing, she said, isn't when people don't have enough. It's when they have enough but they don't know it, when the fear gets ahead of the reality. She looked at May. What you're doing, keeping the fear down, that's harder work than the eggs. They left her house in the early afternoon and pulled the sled home through the cold, and neither of them said much for a while. It was Silas who spoke first. She knows. She's known for weeks, probably, May said. She's just kinder about it than asking. Do you think she'll say anything? No? May was quiet for a moment. People like her, people who've seen enough winters, they know the difference between a secret that hurts people and a secret that keeps things working. She's not going to break something that's working. On December 18th, Garrett Hoyle appeared at their door. He came alone, without announcement, in the early evening when the temperature had dropped to 4 degrees, and his presence at the door was accompanied by a significant quantity of cold air that May immediately moved to shut out by getting him inside as fast as possible. He sat at their table with his hat in his hands and looked at the map on the wall. The full chamber map, with its zones and labels and May's marginal notes, which they hadn't taken down because it simply hadn't occurred to them to hide it in their own home. And he was quiet for a long moment. Mountain site, he said. Yes, Silas said. In there. He gestured at the map without looking away from it. That's the chamber. Yes. Hoyle studied the map for another long moment. His expression was unreadable in the way of men who have taught themselves to think before they react. How many eggs have you given away total? He said. May answered without looking at the log, because she had the numbers memorized. 231, as of today. Hoyle was quiet. Outside, the wind was doing something serious, the kind of serious that rattled the window in its frame on the north side of the house. And you've still got enough for yourselves. And then some, May said. The flock is still producing. We're still collecting. How long? Through winter, as far as we can tell. Possibly through spring. Hoyle turned his hat in his hands, one slow rotation. You should have told me sooner, he said. We weren't sure about you, Silas said, honestly. Hoyle looked at him. Fair, he said. I'd have done the same. He looked back at the map. What do you need? Silas blinked. What? What do you need? From me. You're running this whole thing with 2 people and 1 sled, and you're covering the whole valley. He put his hat on the table. My feed situation has stabilized, thanks to your eggs giving me money to buy what I was short on. I've got time, and I've got a horse that can pull a heavier sled than yours. What do you need? May looked at Silas. Silas looked at May. It was the look of 2 people who had been carrying something alone for long enough that the offer of help landed strangely, not unwelcome, but requiring a moment to process. We need deliveries on days when the weather makes the mountain inaccessible, May said. If we can't get to the chamber but we have eggs in reserve, someone needs to get them to the families who need them most. I can do that. And we need someone who understands what the chamber is before they see it, she said, because if you see it and your first thought is how much can we take, then you're the wrong person for this. Hoyle looked at her steadily. My first thought when I see something that works, he said, is how do we keep it working? I've been ranching long enough to know the difference between an asset and a resource you're burning through. He paused. Show me tomorrow, if the weather holds. Tomorrow, Silas said, if the weather holds. The weather held. Barely, grudgingly, the way Wyoming weather holds things, with the constant implication that it could change its mind. They took Hoyle up the slope in the morning, through the juniper curtain, down the passage that was wider now by nearly 6 inches from Silas's months of careful work, and into the chamber. Hoyle stood in the entrance of the chamber for a long time without moving. He held his candle and looked at the dome ceiling and the nesting shelves and the hundreds of birds and the accumulated eggs, and his face went through something private that he didn't share and Silas didn't ask him to. When he finally spoke, he said, How long has this been here? Longer than we have, May said. By a lot? Probably. Hoyle nodded slowly. He walked further in, carefully, not disturbing the birds, moving with a rancher's practiced economy of motion around animals. He looked at the marked eggs, asked May to explain the system, listened to her explanation of the 4-day protocol without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "That's smart." "It's necessary," May said. "Without it, we'd take eggs that shouldn't be taken. Mess up the cycle. I understand." He walked back to where they were standing. "Who else knows about this place?" "Nobody," Silas said. "Not specifically. Some people have guessed parts of it." "The widow Haskell," Hoyle said. "How did you know?" "Because she's the smartest person in this valley, and she's been watching you two all autumn." He almost smiled. "She told me she thought you'd found something useful in the mountain. Didn't say what. Said it was your story to tell." Silas thought about the old woman in her kitchen, drinking her strong tea, talking about fear getting ahead of reality. "She's a good judge of what to say and when," he said. "She's been in this valley longer than most of us have been alive." Hoyle looked around the chamber one more time. "What are your terms?" "For me, helping with deliveries." "We're not in the business of terms," May said. "We just need to know you understand the chamber comes first. Every decision gets made based on whether it protects this place, not on whether it's convenient, not on whether it benefits any one family more than another." "The community," Hoyle said. "The community," she agreed, "but only insofar as the community doesn't compromise this." She gestured at the dome ceiling, the birds, the ancient stone. "This was here before us. It'll be here after us, if we're careful." Hoyle was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You two came out here from Ohio, what, 7 months ago?" 8, Silas said. 8 months. He looked at them both, at May with her map in her coat pocket, at Silas with the chisel marks still faintly visible on his hands from months of slow, careful work on the passage walls. "You know what I thought when you first showed up in this valley?" "I think I can guess," Silas said. "Probably," Hoyle said. "And I was wrong." He extended his hand to Silas, then to May. "Tell me where the deliveries are most needed this week, and I'll start tomorrow." They came back out through the passage into the Wyoming cold, all 3 of them, and the sky above was the color it gets before more snow, that particular committed gray, and the valley below held its scattered homesteads and their thin columns of smoke, and the human effort of people trying to stay alive in a place that was not especially interested in helping them. "Haskell first," May said. "She's been stretching the last batch further than she should have. Then Lindqvist. Bjorn's ribs still aren't right, and they need more than we've been leaving." Hoyle nodded, already calculating the route in his head, the order that would make the most sense on horseback in the kind of weather that was coming. "I'll take the northern run," he said. "You do the closer ones." Silas looked at the sky. More snow coming, more cold. More of the valley drawing in on itself the way people do when the world outside gets too hard and the inside of the house becomes the only manageable geography. But also a chamber full of warmth and eggs and ancient patient birds that had been doing this long before anyone needed them to. Also, a map on a wall and a log with accurate numbers and a sled with 2 drag ropes and a system that worked because they'd made it work one careful day at a time. Also, now, a neighbor who understood the difference between taking and protecting. It wasn't enough to stop worrying. It never was. But it was something real, and real things, Silas had learned this in 8 months of Wyoming, were worth more than any number of theoretical comforts. He followed May and Hoyle down the slope toward the valley, the sled tracking crooked on the left runner the way it always did. And the snow was coming, and they had work to do. Part 5 lưu ý. Viết 4.000 đến 4.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện. Pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước, không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết, lan man, có quan điểm cá nhân, thông điệp, bài học, góc nhìn con người. Nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương, sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sảng, có yếu tố con người, cấm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo, Phần 5 giải quyết hết vấn đề và kết thúc trọn vẹn câu chuyện. Câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document. Chỉ đàn bắt buộc không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí. Không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Show more. Part 5. A legacy stronger than survival. The worst storm of the winter came on January 11th and stayed for 6 days. Not 6 days of continuous snowfall, exactly, but 6 days in which the sky never fully committed to stopping. It would ease for a few hours, enough to make you think it was done, and then come back with the particular stubbornness of something that hadn't finished making its point. The temperature dropped to 11 below on the third night, and Silas woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of the north wall making a sound he hadn't heard before. A low creak that could have been the cold or could have been something structural, and he lay in the dark for 20 minutes listening to it before deciding it was probably the cold and going back to sleep, which was less a decision based on certainty and more a decision based on the fact that there was nothing useful he could do about it at 2 in the morning if it was structural either. May slept through all of it, which was her gift and his consistent quiet envy. By the 4th day of the storm, they hadn't been to the chamber since January 10th. 6 days was the longest gap since they'd discovered the place, and Silas had noticed, without commenting on it, that May had started checking the log every morning the way some people check the sky. Not because the information had changed, but because the act of checking was something to do with the anxiety. Hoyle had come by on the 2nd day on horseback through conditions that Silas would have called impassable and that Hoyle apparently considered inconvenient, to report that he'd made it to the Lindqvist place with the reserve eggs they'd set aside before the storm hit, and that Bjorn's ribs had finally healed enough that the man could work again, and that Clara Peterson had asked Hoyle to pass along that their youngest had started sleeping through the night, which had nothing to do with eggs or winter survival, but which Clara had apparently felt was news worth sharing. She said May would want to know, Hoyle had said, standing in their doorway with ice in his beard, holding his hat. May had smiled at that, a real one, not the careful kind she deployed in difficult conversations. She's right. Tell her I'm glad. Hoyle had gone back out into the storm, and Silas had watched him go and thought about what it meant that a man who had once watched them ride in from Ohio with the polite skepticism of someone watching a theatrical performance was now riding through a blizzard to deliver their eggs and relay news about a baby sleeping through the night. Things changed, that was all. Things changed in ways you couldn't plan for, and some of those ways were better than you'd expected. On the 7th day, the storm stopped, decisively and completely, the way Wyoming storms sometimes ended, like a decision rather than a fading. The sky cleared to a blue so sharp it looked brittle, and the snow that had accumulated sat in drifts that Silas estimated at 4 feet in places, and the world was entirely white and absolutely still and brutally cold, and, in its own indifferent way, beautiful. They went to the mountain. The slope was difficult in a new way. The drifts had redistributed the terrain, and the path they knew was buried under configurations that hadn't existed before. Silas went first with a long stick he'd been using since November to test the snow ahead of his feet, and May followed in his steps, and it took them nearly twice as long as usual to reach the juniper curtain, which was itself buried to its lower branches. They pushed through. Down the passage, Silas's months of careful widening work had made the passage functional even in their heaviest coats, which was good because in this cold there was no option for a lighter coat. Through the stone throat of the entrance, and then the chamber was unchanged. That was the thing that hit Silas every time, and hit him again now with the particular force of something that hadn't become ordinary no matter how many times he'd experienced it. The world outside could arrange itself into any configuration of difficulty, and the chamber simply continued being what it was. The same temperature, the same ventilation, the same dome ceiling with its mineral sparkle in the candlelight. The birds settled and content, going about whatever birds go about when there are no humans watching. May stood beside him in the entrance and let out a breath that she'd been holding, he suspected, for most of the past 6 days. "All right," she said quietly. "All right," he agreed. They worked through the full zone rotation that morning, checking every marked egg, noting every new abandonment, updating the log with the careful completeness that May had never allowed to slip even on mornings when she was tired or the cold made her hands stiff. The number in the log, when they'd finished and were sitting on the work ledge near Zone D, was significant. Total collected since October, May said, reading from the log. 412 eggs. Given away, she paused, running her finger down the column. 339, across 7 families. 7, Silas said. He hadn't quite tracked that number. They'd started with 3 and he knew others had been added, but the exact count hadn't registered. When did it become 7? Mrs. Haskell, the Petersons, the Lindqvists, Hoyle, the Olsons, that's 5. Then the Marchetti family in December, when Rosa Marchetti came to us directly and asked. May closed the log. And the Burkes. Hoyle told us about the Burkes in early January, remember? He did remember vaguely, a family on the far eastern edge of the valley that Hoyle had been monitoring because the husband had been sick since November, and the wife was trying to manage the homestead alone with 2 teenagers. We never met them, he said. Hoyle handled those deliveries, but they're in the log. Silas sat with the number for a moment. 339 eggs. 7 families. A winter that had not broken anyone in this valley, at least not yet, with the worst of it theoretically behind them now. February was brutal, but it was at least a known brutality, the kind you could see the end of from where you stood. May, he said. Do you think... He stopped, restarted. When we started, I was thinking about us, about getting through to spring. That was the whole thing. I know. And somewhere in October or November, it stopped being about us, and I'm not sure exactly when that happened. May was quiet for a moment. Around them, the birds made their low, continuous sounds, the white noise of the chamber that had become so familiar he sometimes heard it in his sleep. I think it happened in stages, she said. There wasn't a single moment. It was more like you keep making one decision and then another one, and each one takes you a little further from where you started, and eventually you look back and can't see where you started anymore. Does that bother you? She looked at him. It was a direct look, the kind she gave him when she was being precise about something. No, she said. Does it bother you? He thought about it honestly. Sometimes, he said. Sometimes I miss when it was just us, when the problem was smaller. The problem was never actually smaller, May said. We were just less aware of the full size of it. That was true. The valley had always been a community, had always been interdependent in the ways that isolated places are, where one family's failure sent ripples through everyone else's winter, where one family's luck could stabilize people they'd never spoken to. They hadn't created that. They'd just somehow stumbled into the middle of it. They came out of the mountain in late morning and started down the slope, and about 2/3 of the way down, Silas stopped walking. He'd seen something, or rather, he'd seen someone. There was a figure standing at the base of the slope, near the edge of where the homestead territory ended and the raw mountain terrain began. A man, motionless in the snow, looking up at them. He was too far away to read his expression, but his posture had something in it that Silas didn't immediately categorize. Who's that? May said from behind him. I don't know. They continued down, and as they got closer, Silas recognized the build, and then the coat, and then the particular way the man stood with his weight slightly back, and his arms at his sides, and his head at an angle that suggested he was thinking rather than waiting. It was Arvid Peterson. He had walked apparently the full distance from his homestead to the base of the Rowan Mountain slope, which was a serious undertaking in current snow conditions. He was breathing harder than normal, and his boots showed the snow to the knee. Arvid, Silas said when they were close enough. What's wrong? Is it Clara? The children? Everyone's fine, Arvid said. He looked past Silas at the slope they'd come down, at the path their feet had made in the snow, at the mountain above. He looked at the sled and the collection bag and the log that May was putting back in her coat pocket. I've been doing arithmetic, he said. Silas waited. 40 eggs the first time you came, then 30 more 2 weeks later, then 20, then another 30. 7 families over 3 months, he looked at Silas directly. I'm not a stupid man. Nobody said you were. No. Arvid was quiet for a moment. The cold was serious, and he hadn't buttoned his top coat button, which told Silas he'd left in a hurry. "I want to see it," he said. "Whatever it is, I'm not asking to take anything or change anything. He stopped. Something moved through his expression that was harder to name than simple curiosity. "Clara's been worried since October. We've all been worried. And you two have been—" He paused again, choosing. "You've been the reason we're still here. I'd like to understand why." Silas looked at May. May looked at Arvid Peterson, at his unbuttoned coat and his snow-soaked boots and his expression, which was not demanding but was very serious. She looked at him for long enough that it might have been uncomfortable, and Arvid bore it without looking away. "Come up," she said. They took him through the juniper curtain and down the passage. Arvid was broader through the shoulders than Silas, and the passage, even widened, required him to angle through carefully, and into the chamber. He stood there for a long time, longer than Hoyle had, longer than either Silas or May had stood there on their first morning, because they at least had had some preparation, some inkling of what they were walking into. Arvid Peterson had nothing but the end of his own arithmetic, which he was now discovering was not the same thing as understanding. He didn't speak for a full minute. When he did, what he said was, "My youngest was born in September." It wasn't what Silas had expected. He didn't say anything. "We had nothing," Arvid continued. "I mean that literally. We had the house, and the stock, and the stores, and I had done the numbers, and the numbers were very clear, and there was no—" He stopped. Clara didn't know how bad it was. "I didn't tell her because she'd just had the baby, and there was no point in both of us not sleeping." He looked at the dome ceiling. "Then you showed up with 40 eggs, and I stood at my door and looked at that sled, and I thought—" He exhaled. "I thought, either these people are different from every other person I've met in Wyoming, or they've done something very stupid, and they're about to come to grief and drag us into it." "Which was it?" Silas said. Arvid almost smiled. "Neither," he said, "which I didn't know was an option." He looked at May. "How did you know?" "That it was safe to use, that you weren't going to ruin it." "We didn't know," May said. "Not at first. We tried to go slowly enough that we could stop if something went wrong. And if something had gone wrong, then we'd have stopped," she said simply, "and we'd have had a lot fewer eggs, and you'd have had a harder winter, but the birds would have been fine." She looked around the chamber. "This place doesn't need us. I think that's the thing to understand. We didn't save it, and we're not running it. We're just being careful about how much we take." Arvid nodded slowly. He walked further in, the way Hoyle had, carefully around the birds. He crouched near one of the nesting shelves and looked at the eggs in their natural groupings, at the coal marks May had put on the ones in the observation cycle, at the easy proximity of birds who had never been given a reason to fear humans, and so simply didn't. "What do you need from us?" he said, without looking up. The U.S. was deliberate. Silas caught it. "Same thing we needed from Hoyle," May said. "To understand the place before you try to help with it, and to agree that protecting it comes before any individual family's needs, including ours." "Including mine," Arvid said. "Yes." He stood up. "Done," he said. It was the same quality of finality as Bjorn Lindqvist's nod back in November, the thing that men who mean what they say sound like when they actually mean it. "There's one more thing," May said. Arvid waited. "In the spring, when the valley comes back together, when people can travel and meet and talk properly, I want this to be a conversation everyone has, not a secret we manage and deliver to people one at a time." She looked at Silas, then back at Arvid. 7 families know pieces of it. A few people have guessed most of it. The widow Haskell has probably figured out all of it. At some point, the secrecy stops protecting the chamber and starts just being secrecy for its own sake, which doesn't serve anyone. Silas hadn't known she was going to say that, or he'd suspected she'd been moving toward it, had seen the direction in the way she'd been talking for the past few weeks, but hearing it stated out loud was different. "You want to tell everyone," he said. "I want the valley to decide," she said, "together, what this place is, what it means, how it gets used going forward. We made decisions in October that were right for October. I don't think we should be making decisions for the whole valley in perpetuity from our kitchen table." Arvid was looking at her with something in his face that was not quite admiration and not quite surprised, but occupied the space between them. "You know," he said, "most people who found something like this would be thinking about how to own it." "We don't own it," May said. "We found it. That's different." "Most people don't think so." "Most people are wrong about that particular thing," she said without heat, just as a statement of fact. Arvid left an hour later, back down the slope to his homestead, and they watched him go from the junipers. He walked steadily through the snow, his unbuttoned coat still unbuttoned, and at one point he stopped and stood very still for a moment, and then kept walking, and Silas thought he understood what that pause was about. "Spring meeting," Silas said. "Spring meeting," May agreed. The winter had one more serious blow to deliver in mid-February, but it was shorter than the January storm, and the valley handled it differently. Hoyle coordinated the supply runs without being asked, showing up at the Rowan place the morning after the storm hit with his heavy sled already loaded with the reserve eggs they'd set aside. Arvid Peterson had spoken to Bjorn Lindqvist, who had his ribs back and his full strength and could now make the northern route that had been hardest for the others. The widow Haskell, who had not been told officially but had organized herself officially regardless, had apparently spent the storm preparing a quantity of preserved vegetables from her root cellar and sent them out with Hoyle on his second run as a supplement to the eggs. "She said to tell you," Hoyle reported to May, "that eggs are protein but they're not everything, and she's been doing this long enough to know the difference." "She's right," May said. "She usually is." What Silas noticed in those February days was that the system no longer required them to manage it. That was the thing that crept up on him quietly, and then announced itself one afternoon when he realized he hadn't made a delivery decision in 4 days because Hoyle and Arvid and Lindqvist had made them, correctly, without consulting him. He mentioned this to May and she said, "Good," without looking up from the log she was updating. "Doesn't that bother you?" he said. That we're not necessary?" She looked up. "Silas, the goal was never to be necessary. The goal was to make sure the valley got through the winter. We did that. The fact that it's running without us now means we did it right." He sat with that. He wasn't sure he entirely believed it. There was a part of him, he admitted to himself honestly, that had gotten used to being the person who knew, the person who had figured something out that other people hadn't. It was a small pride, maybe an unworthy one, but it was real. "Also," May said, returning to the log, "we're still necessary. Nobody else has been tracking the behavioral patterns in Zone F." He laughed. It caught him off guard, the laugh. A real one from somewhere that had been too cold and too worried and too busy for laughing. May looked up at the sound of it and smiled, and for a moment the kitchen was just a kitchen and they were just two people who had gotten through something hard. The Valley meeting happened on the first Saturday in April. It had taken 2 weeks of coordination, mostly by Hoyle and Arvid working together, to get all 7 families in the same place at the same time. The location was the Peterson barn, which was the largest enclosed space in the valley, and which Clara had spent 2 days cleaning in preparation with an attention to detail that suggested she understood this was not an ordinary gathering. Silas and May drove there in the morning with the map, the full map, both sheets, properly finished now, and mounted on a piece of board May had prepared, and the log, which ran to 63 pages of careful notation. Everyone was there when they arrived. 14 adults and 11 children, which made the barn feel occupied in a way that Silas realized he'd been missing without knowing it. The widow Haskell was in the corner on a chair that someone had brought for her, and she looked at Silas when he came in with an expression that contained several layers of told you so, none of which she voiced. Hoyle ran the meeting, which was May's suggestion because she didn't want it to look like she and Silas were in charge of something that was supposed to belong to everyone. He was good at it, practical, fair, not given to speeches. He laid out the facts briefly and accurately. Then he put the map on the wall and stepped back. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Rosa Marchetti, who was 42 and had come to Wyoming from Pennsylvania with the specific intention of being taken seriously and had not always found Wyoming cooperative on that front, said, "How many eggs are in there right now?" "Approximately 350 accessible abandoned eggs," May said, "plus the active population, which we don't touch." "And the birds won't leave? If more people go up there?" "They've been fine with us Hoyle, Arvid, and Bjorn going in," May said, "but that's 4 people who've been trained on the protocol. I don't know what happens if 20 people show up unannounced." "Then we don't do that," Rosa said. "We keep it to a small group, Rotate the people. That's what I'd suggest, May said. The meeting went for 2 hours. It was not, Silas would later reflect, a smooth 2 hours. Bjorn Lindqvist thought the zone system was unnecessarily complicated and said so plainly, which led to a 10-minute conversation between him and May that was technically polite and practically tense, until Arvid intervened and suggested they table the specific methodology and discuss the principle first. The Olsen husband, a quiet, deliberate man named Gunnar who hadn't said much all winter, asked what happened if the birds left on their own, if the chamber simply stopped being what it was, and that question landed in the room with more weight than he'd probably intended because nobody had an answer. Then we deal with that when it happens, Hoyle said, which wasn't satisfying but was true. 2 of the older children had slipped away from the adult conversation and were playing in the corner and at one point knocked over a bucket with a sound like a small explosion. And for a moment everyone just stared at the bucket and then slowly started laughing, which released something in the room that had needed releasing. The widow Haskell spoke once, near the end, when the conversation had been going in circles on the question of governance, who made decisions about the chamber, how disputes were resolved. "You're overthinking it," she said from her corner. The room went quiet. "You want a rule? Here's a rule. Nobody takes more than they need, and everybody tells the truth about what they need. That's the whole system. Everything else is just paperwork." She said it the way she said most things, plainly, without emphasis, as if she were describing the weather. And it landed the way plain things land when they're accurate, with a small, settling weight. The room absorbed it. Then Arvid said, "I think that covers it." And it did. What they agreed on, in the end, was simpler than Silas had expected and more durable than a document would have been. May and Silas would continue to manage the chamber and the collection system, but access and delivery would be shared with any Valley family who committed to learning the protocol. The 4-day observation rule was not negotiable. Bjorn had backed down on that one when May explained patiently, for the second time, exactly why it existed. No delivery to any family would exceed what that family estimated they needed, and families would estimate honestly. The log would be maintained by May and available to anyone who asked to see it. It was, as the widow Haskell had indicated, just common sense organized on paper. The fact that it needed to be said out loud was a reflection of human nature, not a failure of it. Walking home that evening, the April air still cold but differently cold, with the quality of something that was thinking about changing, Silas said, "How do you think that went?" "Better than it could have," May said. "Worse than it would go if everyone were perfect." "Nobody's perfect. No." She was quiet for a moment. The valley was pink in the last light, the snow line on the mountains visibly higher than it had been in January. Somewhere to the north, an actual bird, not a goose, something smaller, was making noise in a tree, the first bird noise that hadn't belonged to their flock that Silas had heard in months. "Bjorn's going to argue with the protocol again," she said. "Probably more than once." "Probably. And Gunnar Olsen is going to worry about the birds leaving, constantly. He's going to bring it up at every meeting." "Is he wrong to?" "No," May said. "He's not wrong. It's a real thing to worry about. I just hope he doesn't make everyone else anxious about it before anything actually happens. You can't control what people worry about." "I know." She looked at the mountains. "I can just make sure the worry doesn't turn into decisions we'll regret." They walked the rest of the way in silence, the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. The chamber didn't disappear. The birds didn't leave. The spring came late and grudgingly, the way spring comes in Wyoming, less a season than an argument the year has with itself. And as the snow retreated up the slopes and the valley slowly reasserted itself as a place where things could grow, the goose flock in the mountain expanded rather than contracted. New birds arrived in April, which May had suspected might happen based on the behavioral patterns she'd been tracking since November, and which confirmed something she'd been careful not to say aloud until she was sure. The mountain site was not just a winter refuge. It was a permanent feature of how these birds had organized their lives, had probably been organized for longer than anyone now walking this valley had been alive. She added a new section to the log in April, titled simply Spring Observations. It ran to 11 pages by May. Silas finished the floor edition in March, the one they'd planned last year. that had been waiting for the lumber they'd originally earmarked for the sled bed. He'd found other lumber for the sled, and the floor addition had sat unfinished through the entire winter and was now finally done, pale new boards that smelled of pine and made the interior of the house feel different in a way that was disproportionate to the actual square footage added. May walked across it the morning it was finished and said, "It's level." "Both sides," he said with moderate pride. "Your joinery's better." 7 months of practice. She looked at him. "On a passage wall." "Turns out stone and wood have some things in common if you're paying attention," he said, which wasn't entirely true but wasn't entirely false either. It was late May when Arvid Peterson stopped by the homestead, not on sled business, just stopped by, which was something that hadn't happened before, and sat at their kitchen table with coffee that was no longer being stretched because the supply situation had normalized, and asked how the spring collection was going. "Well," May said, "the new birds are still settling into the existing zones. We're not collecting from the new areas yet." "Smart." Arvid wrapped his hands around his cup. "Clara wants to know if May will come for dinner next week. The children have been asking about you." May looked faintly surprised. "About me?" "The older ones know. We told them some of it. That you found something in the mountain and shared it." He paused. "My daughter has decided you're the most interesting person in the valley." "Your daughter has not met enough people," May said. "She's 8, Arvid said. "She has time." He looked at Silas. "How are you holding up? Honestly." It was a different kind of question than anything Arvid had asked before. Silas considered it properly. "Tired," he said. "But the good kind. The kind where you're tired because you actually did things." Arvid nodded. He understood that distinction. "The valley's different," he said. "From before. I don't know exactly how to say it." "I know what you mean," Silas said. "It's not that everything's easier. The work is the same, the weather's the same, half my fence is still in bad shape, and spring planting is going to be what it's always been." He looked out the window toward the mountains. "It's more like we know things about each other now, things you only find out when the situation is bad enough to require them." Silas looked at the map, which was still on the wall above the table, and which he suspected was going to remain there indefinitely. He looked at the log, which sat beside it on the shelf in its growing stack of pages. He looked at May, who was listening to Arvid with the full attention she gave things that deserved it. He thought about October, about 43 days of food, and 11 geese, and 1 crack in a cliff face. He thought about how the whole story had been, at its root, a story about what you do when you find something larger than yourself, whether you grab it or whether you try, imperfectly and with plenty of mistakes along the way, to be responsible for it. He didn't think they'd gotten it right every time. He was sure they hadn't. There were eggs they'd taken too early, and decisions they'd made from incomplete information, and at least 2 conversations with Hoyle in January that he wished he'd handled differently. The system they'd built was good, but not perfect, and the meeting in the Peterson barn had resolved things temporarily, rather than permanently, and there would be arguments about the protocol and disagreements about distribution, and moments when the whole thing felt more fragile than it should. That was just how things that were real worked. They required maintenance. They required people to keep choosing them, again and again, on days when choosing something else would have been easier. "Dinner sounds good," May said to Arvid. "Tell Clara we'll come Thursday if the weather holds." "It'll hold," Arvid said. He stood, picked up his hat. "Probably." After he left, the house was quiet in the particular way it was quiet when something had just resolved. Not silent, because outside the valley was doing its spring things, the birds and the wind, and the distant sound of Hoyle's horses on the road, but settled. May picked up the log and opened it to the current page and made a notation. The day's date, spring observation number 43. A brief record of which zone she'd checked that morning and what she'd seen. She wrote in her usual hand, even and precise, the hand of someone who understood that the record mattered. Silas watched her and thought about the first morning, the empty pen, the tracks in the frost, the narrow gap in the juniper curtain, and the warmth that came from behind it, and the darkness beyond that warmth that had held, as it turned out, exactly what they'd needed, and nothing more and nothing less. He thought about how the geese had known where to go, had always known, had been going there probably since before there were homesteaders in this valley to notice them. The mountain had not needed discovery. It had simply been waiting for the right kind of attention. He got up and put his coat on and went outside. The May air was cold and bright. The mountains stood where they always stood, unchanged by everything that had happened at their feet over the winter. The storms, the deliveries, the meeting in the Peterson barn, the 63 pages of careful notation, all of it. The mountains didn't care about any of it. They were just mountains. The chamber was just a chamber. The birds were just birds, doing what they'd always done, in a place that had always worked. The human parts, the choice to follow, to be patient, to share, to protect, those were the parts that hadn't been there before October. Those were the parts that Silas and May, and eventually the whole valley had made. He stood in the yard for a while, looking at the white peaks in the distance, and let himself feel something he was usually too busy or too careful or too tired to feel. A kind of plain, unembellished satisfaction. Not pride, exactly. Not happiness, which was too light a word for what this was. Something more like, this happened, and it mattered, and we did not ruin it. May came to the door behind him and looked out. The geese went up early today, she said. I know, I saw them go. Zone C had a new cluster this morning. 6 eggs, all fresh marked. She leaned against the doorframe. We're going to need more log pages. I'll get paper next time someone rides to town. More than you think we need, she said. Get more than you think we need. He looked at her, at the doorframe and the pale blue curtain behind her, and the kitchen with its map and its log and its uneven table that he'd also never quite gotten right. And he thought that he would. He would get more paper than he thought they needed, because she was usually right about that kind of thing, and because the record was going to continue, and because some things, if you were careful enough with them, kept going longer than anyone had a right to expect. The geese were somewhere above them in the mountain, in the warmth and the quiet of the chamber that had been there before them and would be there after. Below, the valley went about its